What is your favorite Evil Dead film? Hello and welcome to the Coop-a-Log special where I watched Evil Dead Burn and I thought it is so great that I must immediately tell you that you should go watch it. It jumps the queue because right now we're actually going kind of in chronological order of the things I'll watch, but for this one, use the opportunity before the Odyssey swoops in and takes all of the all of these screenings, because obviously it's Odyssey season. Just kind of using this opportunity to urge people to take the opportunity while there's still time. That so far this year there has been a lot of horror bangers, and I think there usually is one or two. And this year, Obsession, I don't get the obsession with the obsession. And there's a video on that as well. You can check that out. And Backrooms, also another good one, a good example of elevated horror, but I think Evil Dead Burn is where the two of them meet together to create such a phenomenal work of art that I know is gonna go under discussed, because most of the Evil Dead fans are just gonna go in and expecting the usual thing and get the gore that they really love so much, very inventive gore, and just be satisfied with that. But I think if you dig a little bit deeper, you're gonna see that there is a lot more under the flesh of this film here, and most other people are just gonna dismiss it for another gore fest. Look, I'm not gonna beat around the bush, and I'm gonna admit that of course it's a very gory film, but within that just provides a heightened emotional state to which I feel like the themes of the film are just explored at a visceral level. And usually I have my own little notebook to read my notes from, and I don't have any teleprompter either. Everything is just streaming consciousness from my mind, and I do have some notes. I'm gonna be reading them, and hopefully this is as organized as it can be. And I think given that I watched this film on Thursday, I loved it so much, I walked out of the cinema, I walked to another cinema, and I watched it again, so it's very clear in my head. So in terms of my thoughts on the film, I think I'm gonna be able to get them across just fine and dandy for you. And also on that second screening, it was in 4DX. I knew that there is a limited opportunity there. I need to strike while the iron is hot, and that's what I did. And I'll do a small little section specifically on 4DX presentation of this and the extra elements that provides. Naturally, those that haven't been to 4DX may not know what I know speaking about specifically. But starting with the synopsis, to those who are not aware, because I wouldn't be surprised if many are not, because I didn't even expect this film to come out, and then it was coming out, and I was very excited for this because Evil Dead 2013 was phenomenal. I think Evil Dead Rise had some really good moments. I have to rewatch it. I think I wasn't that amazed by it. I thought of what it does. It did some interesting things there as well, but Evil Dead Burn just came out of nowhere, and I somehow really knew that I'm gonna love this film, and I did. Honestly, with Odyssey's coming out around the corner, but this is my most anticipated film of the year that I only found out a week or two before it was actually coming out. So that's a really funny thing to say. And Resident Evil as well, Zack Cregger, I know you're gonna do it. That trailer looks amazing. So Evil Dead Burn, I knew this one I'm probably gonna enjoy for no particular reason. In terms of the synopsis, a widowed woman attends the funeral of her dead husband who died in a car crash. After the funeral, she goes with the family of her husband to mourn him in their old family house, and that's where the tension escalates and demons get involved, because it's an Evil Dead film. Of course, there's gonna be some of that, and you kind of know what to expect out of an Evil Dead film. There's gonna be essentially a cabin in the woods, and here you have a house in the woods. It's a little bit more elaborate than a cabin, and within that's where most of the things happen. And where I want to start with this is that I will say that this really caught me off guard, in the sense that how much of a core theme ends up playing a part with the demonic possessions. This has been an ongoing thing ever since Evil Dead 2013, where there's a clear parallels between demonic possession and how Mia acts in that film, and drug addiction, and specifically drug withdrawals, essentially. wherein I thought that was a very clever way to elevate the material, to provide that extra layer of thematic complexity that makes it a more interesting work. And the similar thing is done here to an extremely impressive level to me, because I thought it was so thematically layered and dense that you just wouldn't really expect from an Evil Dead film, and it's done with such an exceptional tonal balance that very few directors are able to pull off to such a level, because when it comes to an Evil Dead film, as I said, it's very gory, and they get very goofy in terms of just how over the top the gore is, and to try to nail a character moment within that, to navigate that minefield of emotional whiplash, is genuinely exceptional. And that is where I'm gonna start going into the spoiler territory. I will still be relatively vague in terms of the specifics of it all, and even though you know in some of the aspects, I think it does not detract from the experience, because I think where the film, what it does so well is how you're able to see the craftsmanship in action, and just how powerful of a work it ends up being as a whole, and just to appreciate how it all comes together is magnificent. And that's where I was just sitting in the cinema. I was totally locked in. So let me just pull out some of my notes here, because I actually write my notes as WhatsApp messages to myself. And before going into the thematic foundation of the film, which in this case is domestic abuse and generational trauma, and also gender roles and victimhood when it comes to family life and marriage as a way to imprison and control women, and the rage that gets passed on through generations, like, that is already like the whole spectrum covered in terms of how you can take one theme in terms of marriage and all of that, and all the complexities layered on top of that in terms of once you have kids get involved in that and how this impacts them, and the way the film does all of that is phenomenal. But where I think I want to start with this is the way it subverts the usual Evil Dead premise, where there's somebody going to be reading from a book, the Necronomicon, and that's how it invokes the evil to possess the individual. But here it doesn't do that specifically like that, and full-on spoiler territory. And even then, I'm not gonna go into what and why and how and who, because apparently they are, I think, establishing almost narrative throughout the films. I'm not sure if this is gonna be an Avengers style Evil Dead film where, look, in most cases I'd be like, oh, not another franchise, but here I actually kind of would want to see that. I think I've very much identified my niche. I think this film was like very much done for me, and I can maybe understand maybe why some of the comic book fans get excited by those films, because I kind of want to see that for Evil Dead. Although I don't know how old Bruce Campbell would be at that point. Anyway, in terms of the previous films, the curse is invited into the people and then it gets spread. But here, instead of being invited, it is essentially already exists within one of the characters, and then it gets spread. And so within that, how it makes it different is that it's a more clear metaphor for the burning rage and how it can get passed on to different people, and of course how it then ends up being specifically targeted at women. And that it is still clearly within the Evil Dead framework of how that works, but it just makes it a little bit different, to where it is a motivated change to add narrative complexity. And I hope that Evil Dead fans, if there is actually like a full-on fandom there, are open enough to the idea to where they're not just completely locked into how an Evil Dead film needs to be established, which is of course through the reading of the forewords to invoke the evil. And so it's really interesting to see how those characters succumb to the rage over time. And so what makes Evil Dead so special is how Deadites toy with their prey by being coy, and also that's part of the narrative design in terms of how they try to exploit the human weakness of those characters. Instead of being a contrivance of movie logic, like how it would be in some of the other films, it becomes a narrative choice that allows the film to explore the narrative and character complexities. It allows the movie to test characters in terms of how some of their flaws or nuances end up working against them. And this is something where they either learned maybe through some of those experiences and survive, or succumb to it. And that's been prevalent in across all of the Evil Dead films to an extent, but Evil Dead Burn takes that to a whole other level, in my opinion, by making it even more connected. And that specific element of how the weaknesses are exploited and how the characters are seduced to the rage is where it's so interesting to me. Transferal of the rage throughout the characters. There is a difference between how it takes over some of the characters compared to the others, because everyone tries to resist the wrath to an extent. Some characters are able to do it for much longer than others. Like, for example, specifically the mom in this film is able to resist this rage longer because in terms of how her life played out until that point, she's used to having to suppress her emotions. Film doesn't say this to you. It believes that you can infer that based on the writing. And so that's some of my points in terms of the thematic complexities of the film, how it's able to navigate that. And there's a lot more examples of this. I'm not going to go too much into the details because I still want to leave some room for you to actually go in and watch the film. And for those that have already seen it, I want to just hear some other opinions on it now that you might be able to, you know what, the film actually has more going on in there. Like, even in the beginning when Alice is attending the funeral and, you know, she's dressed up casually and the mother goes like, oh yeah, you can have my shoes, because she had sneakers on, and, you know, within that Alice has to literally walk in the shoes of the mother of the deceased husband, you know, and she's of course the symbol of the victimhood, so she's someone who had to live with this rage for years essentially. And that's the film kind of nudges you like, oh, you see, she has to walk in somebody else's shoes, you see, it's little things like that. And of course other elements is that, like, parents of the deceased husband. So in this family there's two sons. One becomes a coward because the abuse from his father essentially forced him to be that way, while the other son internalized that rage, making him a monster. And, you know, the film explores that figuratively and literally. That's all I'm gonna say to that. And that explains why the younger son ends up getting a gun to try to act tough, and the two characters, their comment on that. But then it also becomes a narrative device, because a gun in a horror film, oh wow, is gonna be used. So I could go on for honestly a long time providing examples of the psychological elements and how they all contribute to the thematic complexity of the film. But at that point there'd be a very long analysis, and that would be better if I actually had a proper script, whereas here I'm just sharing some of my thoughts, and I hope that you just go out and watch the film for yourself and make up your mind and see that for yourself. And on the point of the gun and how it serves to develop the character and a narrative element within the film, there are so many beautiful setups and payoffs to where you can see that the film such a clear plan in terms of what it sets up to do and how it manages to do it so flawlessly. It just shows that you are in the hands of a creator that wanted something specific to tell, and they're able to do it. And that's just, it is so beautiful to see that. There's no way they would be able to so neatly tie together some of these narrative elements in terms of setting up some of the objects and then finding a way to how to pay them off later. No, that is an example of somebody who had a clear intention of trying to tell a story and able to do so. And that also plays into the way the film actually looks, and some of the shots there that are so genuinely beautiful. There's just so many phenomenal visual flourishes. There's those cut in like impact shots in terms of the montage that provides this level of impact and pacing to the editing and the action, and making even like some of the simpler scenes more dynamic, and where just how the use of the color. Like there's that moment where she runs out of the burning building and there's the smoke and there's just like clearly red, and there's the rage that's coming after her. And of course there's one moment where she is lying upside down and there's this house and like someone is standing inside of the house, and the shot is upside down, so they're like, this person is like standing in hell, and then the camera flips around. That's just examples of how I would all imagine that a lot of those shots existed in the head of the writer and the director, to where they had a very clear idea of what they wanted the movie to be, and luckily enough they were allowed to produce the film in the way that they wanted to, because I refuse to believe that some of these shots were just improvised on the spot, and if they were like phenomenal. And look, if I had the full film in front of me, I'd be showing you different examples. Would rather you just go watch the film yourself, in terms of, instead of just me showing some of the things. And maybe I'll provide some examples here and there. I'll give you a little treat. So I've spoken a little bit about the thematic elements of the film, the psychology, so how the characters are also involved in that, and the narrative design of the film a little bit. Makes it click so much is how the internal conflict of the characters is externalized through the use of the Deadites as a externalization of the conflict, because they will be taunting the victims, and within that, as I said, that's where the element of the characters being tested and having to face themselves a little bit within that framework. This provides a recipe for ultimate catharsis for these characters, wherein the destruction of the symbol also represents the conquering of the trauma or learning of a lesson. This is a few steps above a usual horror films, where the downfall of each character is essentially them failing a test. This is not a usual slasher film or horror flick where characters just die because they need to, and it's a simple premise to provide a few scares here and there. No, there is a narrative element, there's a character development element. So for example, the youngest son is always stuck in a freeze state at the site of conflict and gets tested on this several times. So, and the characters also comment on that, and that's where the psychology also plays a fact in terms of the Deadites testing that psychology. Combination of all of these factors working together in perfect harmony. That is, it's one thing where in the film you'll usually see some elements, I'm like, oh, they did this so well, they did this so well, but maybe here it doesn't come together. But here everything is perfectly comes together. Also maybe appeals to some of my sensibilities in terms of what I want the films to do, and I think this specific point is just that, is that it's really magical how the film is able to beautifully serve the wave of emotional intensity of the character dynamics and also the visceral gore. Because as anybody who's seen Evil Dead knows, that those films are viscerally very graphic. And this provides that level of emotional intensity to where it almost breaks the barriers of your psyche to reach that state, well, emotionally heightened state, to where this message and some of the ideas are able to have so much more of an impact. It's able to be so viscerally graphic and write characters within that. And above that, how the cast is able to take on that challenge. And the cast is perfect at bringing out the complexities of their human selves while being absolutely gleefully evil as Deadites. They're able to chew the scenery with their physical acting and voice work, plus the bit of voice modulation, you know, when they start talking Deadites, and there's that presence of where there is some of their actual voice you can hear underneath that, and their Deadite voice layered on top of that. So within that also just kind of connects what the actual person thinks and how the Deadite self is layered on top of that. It's almost the interplay between Deadite and human self is like the interplay between the shadow and the self, if we're talking about Jungian psychology. You see, I am talking about Evil Dead Burn and Jungian psychology, okay? This is... either I've gone completely nuts, or Evil Dead Burn is just one of the best films ever made. Because it is. It really is. I hope you watch this. That level of tonal balancing and straight up manipulation. It's like, it's one thing to just thread the needle of this, and it's a very goddamn thin needle, and how the film is able to thread the needle so perfectly. But I think just at that point is straight up emotional manipulation, because I don't know how they are able to get away with that. There's only one name, I think, somebody who's able to do that as masterfully, and that is just Park Chan-wook. The highest compliment I can give to anybody. Sebastian Vanacek, I look, that is the biggest compliment I think I've ever given to any director, because Park Chan-wook is my favorite director of all time, and also films that are emotionally dense and thematically dense, and the gore, violence, heightens the emotional state of the characters and externalizes that, and Evil Dead Burn functions on the same level, and that's why I love this film so much. Park Chan-wook, I love Oldboy, Sympathy for Mr. Vengeance, Sympathy for Lady Vengeance in particular, Handmaiden, Joint Security Area. The Decision to Leave is my favorite film of all time. No Other Choice. And so in some of his later films, he's toned down the style. Decision to Leave is not graphic at all, really. No Other Choice has one or two scenes. So if we put this on a spectrum to where No Other Choice and Decision to Leave is on the low side, and Sympathy for Mr. Vengeance and Lady Vengeance here are somewhere in the middle, and Oldboy as well here, then Evil Dead Burn is on the most visceral state there. The way I've described this film is almost like an elevated horror. And in parts it is, but it doesn't have the pretense or the subtlety of a elevated horror. And I don't use the word pretense, pretentious, in technically in the sense that I don't think they are like pretensions. What even is pretentious? Either way I would describe it as just a lack of authenticity, or a fear of committing to a specific message, because within some of the films it's almost like an author has a thing they want to say, but then trying to say that they are too afraid to say it directly, so they hide behind a genre or a metaphor. And that's where there is a very difficult balancing act to do, because at what point are you using a metaphor to and explore an idea in an interesting manner, and at what point are you just hiding behind the metaphor to obscure how the film reflects on you as an author? And this film does not beat around the bush. It has that additional complexities, which I think many people would dismiss and look at this as a usual just gore fest of Evil Dead, the way Evil Dead films are. But as I said, 2014 has some additional elements with drug addiction and overcoming that. Evil Dead Rise is I kind of need to rewatch that, but I think what it is about essentially is about pressures of motherhood, and within Evil Dead Burn, you still have symbolism, and it's very direct. Like, it's not afraid to commit to that symbolism and say that, and there are some narrative moments where the film gets very surrealistic with some of the flashbacks, and because I said the film brings you to that heightened emotional state where some of those elements are able to go right through your psyche left unguarded, and it just works. At least for me, it works. I think I am almost the target audience for the film in the sense that it appeals to so many of my sensibilities. The way it masterfully balances the tone and straight up manipulates the tone, almost like Park Chan-wook, the way it has complex psychology of the characters, the way it has thematic symbolism that is layered into the narrative, the way it has the setup and payoffs of narrative elements. There's just like Chekhov's gun. Have you heard of Chekhov's gun? Rewrite that. Write about the Evil Dead Burn gun, huh? Now the Sebastian Vanishek gun, huh? I'm rewriting the book on cinema writing, huh? What else to even say? Because this is very loosely scripted, I just wrote down some of the ideas afterwards. Oh, I think one other element I would like to say is that this is almost like the closest we will get to a true survival horror film, or like a Silent Hill / Resident Evil film as like an adaptation, because this actually has very clear parallels to Resident Evil 7, surprisingly enough. Not that I would say that the film is or ripping off Resident Evil 7, I don't think it is, because like even that table scene where the dining scene in Evil Dead Burn, it's more specifically to highlight the tension and the gradual escalation of it, because okay, I'm not going more into spoilers, so I'm not drawing clear parallels between the two of them, although maybe there is some inspiration between Resident Evil 7 and Evil Dead Burn, which would be, I think, totally fine to have. Maybe there is some inspiration. Silent Hill, I'm a big fan of Silent Hill 2, my favorite work of art of all time, and there is that also element of the psychology of the characters and how the town of Silent Hill uses the monsters and the environment to torture the characters, to show something to the characters, to test the characters. And at least in the best examples, and by that I mean Silent Hill 2 and Silent Hill 3. Silent Hill 4 maybe? Nah, whatever. And Silent Hill F, there you go. But then Silent Hill F as well. Evil Dead Burn, the whole scenario and the way it works on Alice, it can either serve as a way to completely break her, or to provide a way for her to work through the trauma and move on. And the way the film essentially tortures her throughout all of that, and the state she's in by the end of that, to where it's the visual manifestation of mostly the emotional abuse of being in that relationship does to her, is where I think as a character arc, that is very emotionally resonant, impactful, and the film knows how to build the rest of it around that to support it, and does so masterfully. I would say word beautifully, but I'm not sure that's like the correct adjective to use here. I think I could genuinely go on more, providing more clear examples and exploring the psychology and the themes of the film, the way marriage gets brought up here as a means of control, and with the husband saying how she doesn't want kids and being the catalyst of some of the fights, and it explores that very gaslighting, manipulative dynamic where there's those characters that claim to be family people and only care about family, but within that it's more disguised as a way to control women and lock them into this commitment where now it's not just about the relationship, but also about having another human being in the world that now both of them are somewhat responsible for. And in many cases, unfortunately, most of the responsibility for a child ends up on women, and that's just one of the many interesting thematic layers to the film. Look at it, it's like a Rubik's Cube. You can just you can go on different sides. You can just try to play around with it, try to make the sides line up, and then in the end you get all of those sides that beautifully form a uniform side that is a different facet of the same theme that the film very much clearly has, that it wants to explore. And I think it's a 10 out of 10 masterpiece. I loved it. I genuinely am so surprised that this just came out of nowhere, and I know that this film will most likely, I'm not gonna get too much acceptance in the mainstream because it is too visceral and graphic to be analyzed and accepted by the art house scene, and also very goofy at parts. And it's too good at being graphic and entertaining and engaging for the casual horror slash thriller fans to look at the narrative and the characters at the core. But hopefully within this video I'm able to either lead some of the art house people to maybe try to meet this film halfway, and for the more usual horror fans to maybe reevaluate this film under a different lens and see that there is a lot more ways to engage with this film. And yeah, and also on the last thing, on the 4DX aspect, it was interesting, and I really knew I wanted to watch this in 4DX because I knew that this is a visceral film, and what better way to complement that than having a physical connection with the film by being shaken around in the seat, being poked in the back whenever there's a stab scene, being blown air at your face, and having smoke within the cinema room. I watched Chainsaw Man Raise the Ark, which is also a very emotionally heightened film that is in an airplane that is in the middle of turbulence, and it's the wildest turbulence you've ever been to. And Evil Dead Burn is something like that as well. Paces itself a little bit better in the sense that you will have some moment of emotional explosions and visceral violence where you're gonna be shaken around, but then the movie slows down to have some character moments. In the beginning I thought, like, I'm not gonna survive this film. But then I kind of got used to it, and it has some cool moments. One, for example, it starts snowing in the film, and there was actually snow in the cinema room, and I was like, wow, I'm like, this is magical. Like, by the end of it, the screening room, the screen was a little bit blurry because of the amount of smoke. But as the film went on, I got used to some of that shaking around because I was just so locked into the story, and then it just becomes background aspects, although it was still very much fun, and the additional layer of connecting with the film that I wanted to experience, and I'm glad I had that experience. And I knew there's such a limited opportunity there, window of opportunity to experience that, because everything is going to, first of all, like, there's Moana, this is taking the IMAX screens, which is absolute travesty. Evil Dead Burn should be in IMAX, should be in Dolby, should be in 4DX, and we need to cancel Odyssey. Like, I don't care about Odyssey, I care about Evil Dead Burn. That is the best film of the year. I'm not kidding, they will probably end up in my top 5 of the year by the end of the year. I do not expect that list to shift around. It is one of my favorite films of all time. It's at this stage my favorite film of the year. We're halfway through the year, might still change a little bit. We have a new Ryusuke Hamaguchi film coming out later this year, and the Content Festival happened not that long ago, so there's going to be some interesting films that I'm going to watch and enjoy as well thoroughly. So thank you for tuning in to this Coop-a-Log special. So I do this show where I talk through all of the films I watched throughout the year. Within that, you'll have some really art house films, some popular mainstream films, and one of the reasons I did this one so early is because I assume it's gonna be people looking for the Evil Dead Burn reviews, and hopefully some of you, and if you're new to the channel, and I assume everybody's new to the channel because this has 0 subscribers at the moment, but you can try to check out some of the other films, because I think it's good to have a very diverse cinema diet instead of just watching one genre, and because there is a lot more to cinema, and I hope that this channel will be your gateway to some of that. So browse around. There's of course the long form videos that are produced and posted somewhere, but also the shorts, which are just cut down versions of some of those quick reviews, because unless this is something that I love as much as Evil Dead Burn, usually I'm able to condense most of my thoughts within 3 minutes. But Evil Dead Burn is special, and I hope you check it out. Thank you so much, and thank you for anybody involved with the film for putting this together. It was genuinely, I am excited to follow everybody who's been involved with this film, because it is just out of nowhere, and I think in the year when there's been so much discussion around Curry Baker with Obsession, and I do not remember the name of the person responsible for Backrooms. The horror is still one of the genres of cinema where they allow new voices to experiment, to try something new with a reasonable budget, without too much oversight, because I'm happy for horror fans that still show up in the cinema to support the films. So thank you all so much for keeping the horror alive and providing more opportunity for people to grow, learn, and Sebastian Vanacek looks like an interesting voice. I've not really done any research on him at this stage, because I'll probably check. I think he has some Shudder original, so I assume he might have been in the industry for some time, and hopefully this film will serve as a catapult of his career, because what is here on display is absolutely masterful, and some of the highest praise I've given to any films so far, honestly. And everybody who's produced this, because this has a lengthy producing list as well. Of course, Sam Raimi is still attached to the film. Probably some of that is still his input and fingerprints on the franchise and the foundation shining through. Lee Cronin, who did Rise, and I assume Fede Alvarez was still also attached to this, as he was the one who rebooted the franchise with the 2013, and we have Evil Dead Wrath that is coming up soon. Interesting what they will do with this as a franchise now, and I'm very excited for this. And as an anthology series, I think it can be very interesting. That it's almost like the Predator franchise, where Dan Trachtenberg is telling stories within the Predator franchise, but they are stories about different themes that just happen to have Predator in them, or be in the Predator cinematic universe, and because now it is one. And same with Evil Dead, where they're just films that happen to be in the Evil Dead franchise and maybe connected to some of the elements there, because apparently this family is the family of the guy who researched the Necronomicon. So it's interesting to see how this one develops over time. But with that, all of that said, thank you for tuning in. Go watch Evil Dead Burn, and if you have already watched Evil Dead Burn, I hope you liked it as much as I did, and if you didn't, I hope that this video helps you reevaluate this film. And please go watch it in the cinema. Please buy it digitally on demand, but ideally buy it on Blu-ray. I'm probably gonna get a steelbook, and hopefully you stick around, and bye bye. Dead by dawn! Dead by dawn! You'll be dead by dawn!